last panel today, and we're going to discuss climate stress, local, regional, and global responses. A couple of caveats before we start. Firstly, my name is Kwesi Sansculotte-Greenidge. Let's start with that, who I am. I am the Access and Conflict Advisor within WFP. Now, don't be worried if you don't know what that means. I am not quite sure what my job is either. Second caveat, they asked me for a black and white photo of myself. I didn't realize it was going to be projected behind me as I speak. I feel a little bit like we're on a dating panel and that I might have catfished the audience. Now, I do look like this sometimes when I clean up, but I might not look like this today. Perfect. So today we've got an interesting panel to close out our sessions today. We've had a lot of discussions around elements about cross-border. We've talked a lot about community. We've talked a lot about change. And we're going to bring that together today with a panel that looks at some issues around climate stress and what's being done both, well, triplically, at the local, at the regional, and at the global level. I would introduce the panelists, but I'm very worried that I will mispronounce their names. So let me hand over to the panelists and have them introduce themselves, and then I'll take you through where we'll go with this session.
Thanks, Kwame. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Wafula Okumu, and I'm in Concordis International.
Hi, everyone. My name is Anna Strachan, and I'm from Bodhi Global Analysis.
Hi, I'm Matthew Benson. I'm from the London School of Economics.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jimmy Awany, and I am a member of the Bridge Network in South Sudan.
So before I hand over to the panel, just a few words by way of introduction. I've been sitting here for the past day and a half and thinking, why the Horn? I myself am from the Caribbean, the other side of the world, but we keep coming back to some of these discussions and coming back to the Horn because it's a particular region in a particular time frame. We've heard this already on the first day. It's a region in transition. We may not have heard the word transition used, but what we're talking about is a series of transitions. The Horn is going through political transitions, as we heard on the first day, in terms of governance models, in terms of core versus periphery. It's going through a number of demographic transitions as you have people moving from rural areas into peri-urban areas and falling between the cracks, having not the good social protections and social networks of the rural areas, but also not the services that you would expect from urban areas. It's a region going through economic transition, where you're having a change of economies, a change of partnerships with the Gulf, a change of partnerships with the West, but it's also a region going through a climatic transition. Unfortunately for the Horn, all of these transitions are taking place at the same place in time and at the same point of time. So communities, countries, and regional bodies are grappling with how they deal with these transitions. Some would say that the climatic transition is perhaps the biggest one of our time. What we're seeing from the data is that in the Horn alone, we have 86 million people who are food insecure. I have to plug that because I work for WFP. If I don't mention food, I don't get my salary. So you have 86 million people who are food insecure. Most of those are because of conflict and climate change. Many of those are because of a mixture of conflict and climate change. Some of the highest numbers are found in Ethiopia, where we have 26 million people who are food insecure, largely through conflict and climate change. Sudan, the prediction last year was 14 million. Right now, the prediction is of 19 million people who will be food insecure because of these changes. But what exactly is the relationship between climate change and conflict? It's not a direct causal link, but rather it is an intricate web of alliances, mixtures that basically weaken people's resilience and make them susceptible to shocks, particularly in countries where there are weak governance systems, countries where there are barriers to trade, and where mobility is hampered. Now, while climate change affects everyone, it affects different groups differently. And what we've seen from the research that we've been doing within WFP through our partnership with Adelphi and also with other research institutes is that it affects certain groups more than others. It's no surprise pastoralists are hard hit, women are hard hit, the urban poor are hard hit by the changes that we see here. So what we're trying to do in this panel is walk through a little bit some of the groups that are more affected than others by climate stress and climate change, some of the responses that are being put in place, and what's being done, particularly at the local level, to try and understand how you can mitigate these impacts, particularly looking at it from a cross-border lens. With that, that's the end of my rant. Let me hand over to Anna, who will first talk a little bit through what it looks like from a gendered perspective. What are the risks, implications of climate conflict and climate stress from a gendered perspective? Anna, thank you.
Okay, great. So I hope everyone can hear me. So we were awarded an XCEPT research fund, grant, to undertake research on the extent to which natural resource management and climate adaptation interventions under the EU Trust Fund for Africa's Collaboration in Cross-Border Areas of the Horn of Africa region programme, a lot there, have contributed to gender-sensitive conflict prevention and mitigation in 2 areas, so the Mandera Triangle and the South Omo-Turkana border. So the analytical framework that we're using for this research is the Consortium of International Agricultural Research Centres Gender Climate Security Nexus Framework. And this one's interesting because it looks at how the impacts of climate change interact with gender and social inequalities to affect conflict and human security. So in particular, we selected this framework because it really recognizes that climate change and its impact on conflict drivers, as mentioned by Kwesi just now, and also on human security risks are not gender neutral. And that it's important to consider the gender differentiated drivers and impacts of climate change and conflict and how they interact with each other as well. So as Kwesi mentioned, it's a complex web and we have to understand all the different relationships there. So this Nexus framework identifies 4 interlinked climate-related security risks which have a gender dimension. And these are resource scarcity, loss of livelihoods, mobility and migration, and intra-household and communal conflict. So our research largely focuses on the latter, so on the intra-household and communal conflict, but of course all of these overlap to quite a large extent and are interrelated. So just to flag that this research is very much still ongoing, we actually have teams in the field right now doing the data collection, so the findings I'm going to share with you are definitely preliminary, and you should bear that in mind. But the key things that we're then trying to understand are how the drivers and impacts of natural resource-based and climate-related conflicts in the 2 cross-border areas are shaped by gender norms, and also how natural resources in these areas are managed and shared, and again, how gender norms determine the role that men and women play in natural resource management. We're also very keen to understand how the gender norms determine the role that men and women play in triggering, sustaining, and ending natural resource-based conflict, and the extent to which climate change has also created opportunities for women to play a greater role in conflict resolution and natural resource management. And then finally, we do want to understand to what extent the greater participation of women, if any, in natural resource management has then contributed to greater gender equality in these areas. So the key points that have come out of the research so far are that women are generally excluded from family-related and communal decision-making processes and the traditional governance mechanisms responsible for natural resource management, land governance, and dispute and conflict resolution. We've also found that climate change has had both direct and indirect, positive and negative impacts on women and gender norms in the region, although they are predominantly, I will say, negative rather than positive. So just to kind of delve into this a little bit further, so, and some of these points were made by Oli yesterday, I think, in one of her comments, but water scarcity and unpredictable weather has left women and their households food insecure, and men are away for longer periods with their livestock. So this has forced women often to also have to travel longer distances in search of food and water, and that's increased their vulnerability to violence, and especially sexually based, kind of gender-based violence in the areas in which they live. The unequal access to resources and the lack of participation in decision-making and governance has also limited women's mobility and has left them highly vulnerable to the impacts of conflict and the impacts of climate change when they are left behind. At the same time, the increasing diversification of livelihoods due to climate change, with people having to shift away from pastoralism as their livestock die, and having to find alternative sources of income, have meant that women have had to play a greater role in economic activities. And there's also been an increase in the number of female-headed households, and I think this point has also been made before. But with men going away to conflict, with increases in divorce, and women also remaining unmarried because men can't afford the bride price in many areas, due to loss of livestock from drought and floods, women are having to take on responsibility for households increasingly. So just I think an important point here is that this has had a limited impact on women's decision-making power. Often when the male head of household has left, the woman doesn't then take over the decision-making, but rather the community elders then take decisions for her. But it does mean that women heads of household are increasingly being consulted, at least maybe having a bit of influence on decisions and slightly higher status in their communities. I think an important point to mention here is that, as flagged yesterday, women make up 50% of the population and they're not a homogenous group. But often, due to lack of resources for research, etc., they are lumped together in studies. It's important to note that, yes, women are affected by climate and resource-related conflict in many ways, as highlighted just now, but they are also involved directly as perpetrators and indirectly in some areas. So one of the things that has come out, and this is a preliminary finding, but we have seen it in other research projects, is that women often want to be associated with warriors. Those who are responsible for raiding cattle get rewarded when they come home. In parts of Mandera, women will sing songs to encourage men to fight and to come back with the spoils. So this is something that definitely has to be taken into account in programming. And there are certainly programs that have acknowledged this. And many interventions are now looking at kind of working with women because while they don't have formal decision-making powers, they have the ability to influence their husbands and sons. And in that way, they seek them to play a role in conflict prevention. However, I think the key takeaway here is that engagement needs to focus on both men and women, addressing the ways in which they perceive and influence each other. And while I think everyone knows this in theory, it's maybe not happening so much in practice. And also, we still need to go beyond seeing women as just influencers of men and as having a role on their own in peace-building processes. So I think the final point so far is really that it's generally accepted that increasing women's roles in conflict prevention and resolution will yield positive results, but the evidence base is quite thin. So that's not to say there isn't great literature out there, but it's maybe not that rigorous, and people are not really taking the time to look at impacts actually and come up with that data that supports this. And this is even more so the case when it comes to natural resource and climate-related conflicts, sorry. So a few examples that we have found of interesting interventions from this recent round of research, things like exchange visits between women from different communities, so that they can understand that the communities, the women in the community with whom they have conflict, are also experiencing the same challenges as they are in terms of food insecurity or being left behind, or livestock dying and all of these things. And this seems to have been quite positive, but again, the actual long-term impact of this doesn't seem to be well documented. And there is still a need to kind of generate more of an evidence based on this. I think the other key point here is that most programming at the moment still kind of measures women's involvement in conflict prevention and resolution, including in relation to natural resource conflict, in terms of numbers. And this number of women have been trained on this, and this number of women attended this workshop, and we had 3 people in this meeting, without actually, again, looking at the impact. So until we get away from this in the kind of program design phase and actually look at kind of outcome indicators that measure impact in a more meaningful way, then it's going to be hard for us to understand the benefits that women's participation can really have. And the final thing then in relation to this is that there is still very much a perception, and this has come through again very strongly through this research, and sometimes also from program implementers actually, that women's role in peace building is kind of due to them being kind and gentle and being calm, and they're going to bring this wonderful peaceful presence, but actually that's the only contribution that they can have. And one of the things that came out most recently is, for example, that women are not included in decision-making during conflict over boreholes or pasture because they're seen as emotional or not able to make rational decisions. So they were kind of brought in for nice activities involving campaigns or raising awareness once all the difficult work has been done. So I think there is still a lot that needs to be done to shift opinions on how women are involved and how that's done in a meaningful way. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that. And I won't summarize, but just to say 2 points that jumped out, I guess. One is that 20 years later, after I started my career, we're still having this debate around presence versus participation of women in decision-making spaces, which is incredible. You talked a lot about natural resource management, but also around mobility as one of the key factors. I think this segues nicely into Wafula's presentation, which is now going to talk about borderland management. So looking a little bit up from the community level. Wafula, over to you, Chief.
Thank you, Kwesi. First of all, let me thank XCEPT for organizing this event, and I'm very glad to be here and honored to be part of this panel. I also want to acknowledge the presentations that were made yesterday, because most of them enriched the things that I'm going to share with you today and will make my work much easier. As I pointed out, I'm with Concordis International. It's a UK-based peace-building charity and international NGO, and it has offices and programs in Sudan, South Sudan, Central African Republic, and Mauritania. And Concordis works alongside those involved in or affected by armed conflict, helping them find workable solutions that address the root causes of the conflict and contribute to lasting peace and economic development. It has been instrumental in supporting local mechanisms for peaceful cross-border migration in the context of ongoing conflict between countries such as Sudan and South Sudan, Chad, and Central African Republic. And it has been working in Sudan and South Sudan since 2007 on conflicts between herders and farmer groups. And this work has usually included the Messiah herder groups from Darfur, who, because of the climate change factors, they have been moving across the region. So one of the focuses has been on transhumance and how people move across the borders with their animals. We are lucky that we are one of the we awarded this grant by XCEPT to conduct a study. And the overall objective of the project, which is titled Promoting Locally Owned, Regionally Focused International Responses to Transboundary Insecurity in Central Africa region, and that includes also Sudan and South Sudan. And the main objective is to review and critically evaluate the effectiveness, impact, and local ownership of agreements that promote peace, security, stabilization, and trade in the borderlands. There are key components of the research. The first one is that we are looking at arrangements, processes, approaches, mechanisms, methods, agreements that are in place to handle issues affecting cross-border relations. And in particular, asking questions such as, how effective are the local agreements or arrangements that have been entered into or have been adopted by the communities in the borderlands to address the challenges that face them? Are these arrangements or processes, agreements, are they formal or informal? And also the other question we are trying to find an answer from is, how are they deposited and are they available for referencing? In fact, one of the key agreements that we are looking at, which was signed, I think, last year, has been very elusive to find. And we find out there's also been a lot of efforts that initiatives of entering into new agreements when actually other agreements already exist. So there is this element of reinventing the wheel or coming in and trying to do things without knowing that there's something already that's happening. Or we have in cases where people come in to help and they don't really look into what's happening already and find out if they can reinforce it or work within it, but instead they come up and start a new process, an initiative. So the other key component of the research project is that we're looking at the extent to which the gender-specific issues factor into local agreements, because we find most of these local agreements are driven by men, and usually the gender issues are not very much. For instance, we're asking the question, are local agreements sensitive, responsive to the needs of women and other marginalized groups, and how women, youth, and the other historically marginalized social groups involved in the negotiation, mediation, and border governance processes, if at all. The other issue we are looking in that component is, what is the extent of the women and youth participation in local conflict resolution mechanisms? And the last component of the research, of course, is to look at the extent that these local arrangements have on cross-border relationship, how they affect bilateral and multilateral agreements on cross-border cooperation, because we find there's some bilateral agreements between countries and also with international organizations that have some elements, or they incorporate some of the local mechanisms. So there are a number of key documents that we're critically looking at. For instance, we're looking at the Abia local peace agreements between the Ngok, Dinka, and Mesiria chiefs of February 2016. And we're also looking at the Transhumance Action Plan between Chad and Central African Republic, which was facilitated by the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue in 2022, as well as there are two MOUs of September 2022 and November 2022 that were facilitated by Concordis between prefectural authorities of Central African Republic and Chad. And of course, we're also looking at the reports of mixed commissions, or what we call joint border commissions, between the countries that are of focus. What has happened is that we have contextualized this study, and in the process we have also formulated a level of analysis and an analytical framework. And in doing this, we have tried to contextualize the research in the African borderlands. And in doing this, we are cognizant that the common approach on African borders mainly concentrates on the role of government directing change and managing borderlands. And as such, top-down approaches usually focus on governments and neglect the bottom-up pressures for change that emanate from the daily actions of social groups that interact along and across the borders. This study shifts the paradigm by focusing on the borderlands, whose inhabitants face unique challenges compared to those faced by the rest of the other citizens. By focusing on borderlands, the study is using the local community as a unit and level of analysis. This differs from the state-centric approach that's influenced by international relations theories that lays out the state, the international system, and the individuals as levels of analysis. The model that we are using seeks to counteract the prevailing borderland governance regimes that criminalizes and securitizes borders at the expense of local communities and complicates the objectives of the African Union to transform Africa's borders from barriers to bridges of peaceful coexistence and regional integration. What this essentially does is the research, once it's complete, we hope that one of the impact that we'll have will be the securitization of African borders into a win-win situation in the governance of African borders. By securitizing it, it will be a win-win for border communities, for African government, and by multilateral organizations. So there's the framework that I wanted to share with you. I don't know, Leah can share with me please.
Is this on the screen?
Yeah. I hope I recover my 30 seconds.
Like that.
Well, in the meantime, I'll ask you a question. Have you had a cliche or a statement about African solutions to African problems? So one of the biggest contributions that this research will make is that it's going to introduce a new concept called the borderland solutions to borderland problems. And what we are essentially saying is that the solutions to the borderland problems are actually in the borderland themselves. So we don't have to go fishing, or we don't have to crack our heads when actually they're already there. So if we take time and look and interact with those local communities, we can actually find the solutions that are already there, structures that are already working, and all we have to do is just find how we can reinforce them or how we can fit into what's there. And as the screen is coming on, there are three case studies I would like to share with you. One is the local community. We want to give local community agency in borderland governance, and I'll share with you at least three examples whereby I've observed from first-hand experience of where local communities have agency in terms of governing the borders. One of them is the Mandera Triangle, where from my interaction there, I've come across the existence of clear social and cultural structures that underpin local governance. But sadly enough, when the government comes in, it actually overlooks those local structures and tries to set up a government-imposed governance, borderland governance system, and that complicates how the government interacts with the local community, and then in the end, it finds a lot of problems. And then the other area, another example I would like to give you is the area called Kuku and Madi communities. This is between Sudan and South Sudan and Uganda. And in this community, what we found out is that there have been an increase of clashes between them over things like traditional access to traditional grazing grounds, and also a resolution of disagreements between the two communities. And what happened before is they used to have a space which they used to call Zanzibar, and whenever the communities had a problem, the elders would just assemble in that space and they would address the problem. But the government came in, and that space doesn't exist anymore. So now any disputes solution, any problems that arise from that community is sorted out by the youth, who take up things in their own hand and then exact either revenge or whatever. And then that has contributed to a cycle of violence, which keeps on escalating. So whenever there's a problem on that borderland, usually the government comes in, and then it even aggravates the problem, because the government comes in and says it militarizes, it deploys the military, and then it comes up with this other solution, says let's clearly demarcate the boundary, and that will eliminate the problem, which is not actually. The problem is resuscitating that traditional system that used to be in place. Yeah. Just where I'm concluding. And then the other example I can share with you is between the Dinka and Dinka Malual and the Mesria Resgat 2016 agreement that was signed. And the success factor of such agreement was the willingness of the community leaders who the willingness to engage in talks to address the challenges facing the area, and also the support of national governments as well as international bodies. And then also the enabling environment, which is free from political power plays. So sometimes borders issues happening, when you see problems at the border, actually is a display of the problem between the two capitals rather than the two communities fighting each other. So the participation of external agencies, whether they're churches, national, international NGOs, or international governmental agencies, is critical in the implementation of these local peace agreements or local or supporting these local arrangements. And we should, whenever the local agreement is in place or local arrangement is in place, we should be careful how it's handled, because it can easily be undermined by wider political issues such as contestation over natural resources, which has straddled the border. And the case of Abia is one of the best examples. So I just want to conclude by giving a simple description of this. Previously in Africa, how we have looked at borderlands, we have looked at it from the right-hand side, whereby the state is at the center. And the borderlands, many times, that's why we refer them as frontiers. These are far-flanked, far away, far from the center. And because of that, the borderlands are usually seen as part of the state, and they are subject to what the state thinks and what the state does. So the state sees the borderlands in terms of its national security. So any governance regime that the state extends to the borderlands is in the interest of enhancing national security interest, national interest. So because it's not borderland security, it's national security. It's promoting at the borderland. So we want to shift this. Now we want to put the borderlands in the center, whereby previously the center was surrounded by international interest, and then you have individual and then borderlands. Now we're saying that no, this new paradigm is that where the borderland is now at the center, and then the state, and then the international, and then the regional, and then the international. Thank you so much for giving me my time.
Your time and some more. Thanks so much for that, Wafula. A plea for the reimagining of how we put borderlands, or how we conceptualize borderlands. I guess the question becomes a little bit like African solutions for African problems. Africa nor borderlands exist in isolation as islands. So going back to the question from the Brigadier General at the beginning of this, what would be the role for internationals? What would be the role for UK government, for multilaterals in supporting these kind of agreements? This is something we'll come back to in the Q&A. But for now, I'd like to turn to Matt, who will walk us through the research that they're doing in South Sudan that touches on natural resource dependence and also governance of natural resource, particularly at the local level. Go ahead, Matt.
Yes, so this is a project that we've just done. It's a paper we're about to submit for peer review. So I've co-authored this with Jimmy Awany, who is here from the Bridge Network, but also Joe Greenbaum, who's unable to be here, who's at Berkeley. So the whole interest in this project actually emerges. It's a little bit slightly different in framing this, but it actually, I'll walk you through it, because in South Sudan, as we know, it's one of the world's most oil-dependent countries. And it's not the only one. There are others that are on the continent. The continent heavily depends on export reliance. It's a facet of the post-colonial state, facet of the colonial state before that. And so there are big questions about what decarbonization means once you start to shift away from oil. Because whether we like it or not, the world is going to have to shift away from oil, although we still just have preliminary indications of that taking place. But in South Sudan's case, it's actually more extreme, because currently extracted oil fields are actually about to deplete. By 2030, currently extracted oil fields, and this is sensitive stuff. Not everyone doesn't get discussed very openly in South Sudan, but they are believed to be they will be emptied. There are others that could be accessed, but even if that is to take place, the world is decarbonizing, so this oil still is something that's not sustainable long term. So there are big questions about what decarbonization means for Africa, what it especially means for some of the world's most fragile states that are heavily oil dependent. Just to give you a preliminary indication, and these aren't all fragile countries, but Nigeria, Angola are also heavily oil dependent, and there are others on the continent that rely heavily on these kind of things. And there are big questions about what this shift means when a lot of resources such as lithium and other types of things that are used for natural resources that are extracted from the continent that are then used as part of this green transition that's so important for the rich world and for all of the world, for batteries and these sorts of things, come from the countries that are on the continent. Again, many of them come from conflict-affected places, DRC, South Sudan as well. So there are big implications about what does this whole structure, whole political economy, when I say structure, I mean Alec Duall's political marketplace theory, that all is built around this privileged access to resources, which can be traced back to, again, it's not just something that Salva Kiir has been doing. It's something that goes back further than that to the Sudanese state, like immediately post-independence, but also it's a facet of the colonial state. They were all about exports. You can kind of see that when you look at these images around the board, where you see, especially in the middle one, you see these British shops that were used, and in these sort of things, you can see this. These British goods were sold here, but for the most part, things were taken out. And what that means is that you have very narrow control over who was able to control the state. And that leads to elite competition. It leads to this zero-sum politics over who gets to control the state and these sorts of things. So, that being said, what happens when the oil's gone? What happens when new stuff emerges? And so, does this shift the political economy? Are there other ways that you can actually think through or imagine or even reconceptualize politics in places like South Sudan with some of the most extreme manifestations of this? And so this is what our research has really been about. This project first emerged from being in Yambio with one of our researchers from the Bridge Network, Rose Mabu, and we were there. There's some gold that was being extracted, or rumored to be extracted, and as it turns out, gold, as Jimmy will perhaps say, gold has lots of meanings, but it does refer to natural resources and these kind of things. But there was people were reluctant to have any type of minerals from this region, which is bordering Congo. So I mean, again, if we're to connect this to the cross-border to XCEPT, borders are extraordinarily important for the flow of whatever resources are going to be extracted from South Sudan in whatever kind of global decarbonization or countrywide decarbonization that we see. So a lot of goods then flow into Congo, timber being one of them, but also believed sort of potentially minerals and these sorts of things too, and especially the Ugandan border has a lot of this going on. So it suggested, when people did not want to extract this gold, in quotes, because it actually means lots of things, that there was a resistance, and the resistance that was there was actually to explicitly say, we do not want these natural resources extracted because we did not see any of the oil rents that were taken from the state. None of that money went back to us. It just goes to these guys who fight this war. It doesn't do anything for us, so we don't want to do it. And this is a very poor, South Sudan is one of the world's poorest countries. This Yambio is no exception. There are pockets of relative wealth, but it is not a wealthy place. So this stuff could shift the political economy in ways that people really understand, and yet they're resisting it. So this question that emerged of sort of, well, that suggests that there's a different moral economy or a different way that people relate to resources that doesn't just value getting rich and becoming the biggest man at the table. It's highly gendered, usually men, almost exclusively in the South Sudanese case, who are sort of deeply benefiting from the system. So what else exists that's there? So this question then emerged. We then worked with the Bridge Network of South Sudanese researchers, who we work extraordinarily closely with, and Jimmy is one of the members of, to really try and understand, well, what are these ideas around different natural resources? What does gold mean? Is gold gold? Is it something else? I mean, there's lots of vernacular terms for these kind of things, which Jimmy's going to get into. And as it turned out, the project shifted not necessarily from looking at natural sort of minerals, but we ended up looking much more at timber, because as it turns out, illicit timber flows, especially going into Uganda, are an enormous wealth driver. So, and what are the networks that are going to them? Who are the types of, the factors that Jimmy is going to soon be talking about are really going to touch on these local dimensions about what does this mean at the local level, and in what ways might we be able to see South Sudan's political economy shifting perhaps for the better? Is there a way that you can work with the communities? And again, as I was speaking earlier and when moderating the Sudanese panel, this idea of civicness, like there are lots of ideas. This example of people not wanting to extract the minerals was we would understand that as an example of civicness. Sort of, it's not for the better, greater public good. It is not for the civic good that we extract them, so we won't. So there is this imaginary, and it has with potential to politically catalyze people in the way that we've seen in Sudan, that it could work in other countries too, potentially in South Sudan, which is one of our big questions, is sort of what does it really take to actually mobilize, mass mobilization that's probably needed to shift and transform the political economy of countries, because we're talking about something far more profound than just, okay, we shift away from oil. For Africa, that's going to mean some very severe disruption. And that disruption could be an opening for more democratic or more civic-minded politics, or it could be business as usual. So how is it that we, as kind of academics who work in this sort of global civil society field, but for those of you who are on the donor side, how can you support that? Because that's what we ought to be supporting moving forward. And so those are the big kind of policy implications. The so what question, which I know you love to have told to you. So there's your so what. And just to kind of foreshadow where the research is going, we'll continue to look at that moving forward. But I think in the meantime, we really need to explore what we found, which Jimmy led kind of really played a huge role in sifting through these 213 interviews across 13 different sites, and can really give a sort of granular picture of what we found with lots of implications that he'll go into.
Hello again, good afternoon. Yes, as Matt mentioned, for this research, we worked with the Bridge Network in South Sudan. The Bridge Network is a loose South Sudanese civil society organization based in Juba that has research members that are embedded within their communities, meaning that they're based at various sites within South Sudan. So when they have research projects, they engage their members to conduct interviews for them. So we worked with the Bridge Network that I represent now. We conducted interviews. We conducted over 200, we interviewed over 200 respondents. We were talking about, we were interviewing them about how they understood and interpreted their natural resources, how they related with their natural resources, including oil, like Matt mentioned, timber, gold, gravel, and all that. After our field work, when it was done, we held a workshop in Nairobi with those researchers to reflect on some of these findings and talk through. So what, like Matt mentioned, what I really want to use this session for is to highlight some of the views and perspectives that were coming about on how communities relate to their natural resources. One key thing that came out very strongly was that because of the many years of conflict in South Sudan, communities have been pushed to rely on their natural environment to survive. So the conflict has eroded people's ability people's livelihoods abilities, so they don't have much to rely on except their natural environment. So we see more and more people having to use their environment to the extent that even when there is the understanding that the understanding of how harmful it could be if they overly utilize the environment, they don't have many options. So there is the understanding, but then there is also the recognition that there are their needs and they need to extract it. To the extent that even when government tax collectors come to tax, for example, a charcoal burner or stop a charcoal burner, there is some level of understanding that, look, people's needs are there. So that is one thing that strongly came out that I thought I would highlight here. I noted a quote that I wanted to read from one of the respondents during the interviews. This was a respondent in Nyambio. He said that if the government prohibits us from cutting trees, how does it expect us to survive? The food that the UN gives us is not enough, and the government does not have any plans for its people. Those of us who decided to work and eat from what we produce should be encouraged and praised, because under these very insecure circumstances, we still go out there to supply the market with this important commodity that even the governor and his ministers use in their houses to cook. So you can see there is this understanding that they are pressed and they have no choices. The second point that I want to highlight is that beyond the economic and financial incentives of utilizing the natural resources, in South Sudan, trees hold a very broad significance, cultural and spiritual significance. Some trees were associated with God and spirits to the extent that you are not allowed to cut those trees. Trees like mahogany, for instance, where some people, during the interview, some people say that that their spirits lived in those trees. So if you cut them, then you're messing with the spirits. So this is a common phenomenon. People really associated God with some trees. In addition, trees were associated with rain. They demarcated borders, and they were used as mark stones for hunters to know, so that they can know where they are. So beyond just the financial and economic incentives, you can see that there is a broader element around trees in the context of South Sudan. So given these non-economic logics, one respondent in WOW, for instance, say that if you're cutting down a tree, you need to perform a sacrifice to the gods. But the key point is that the supernatural and spiritual understandings of trees show the level of understanding that the South Sudanese communities have about their ecosystem, and the historical, spiritual perspectives of how they have protected the ecosystem. So even though these spiritual understandings and supernatural thoughts around the natural resources are there, they could have been there too. It shows the deep understanding of how they value and want to protect their natural resources. And again, not to overly romanticize the spiritual elements of trees, for instance, there were diverse views from the interviews that people just they did not really associate very much with those connotations, but they wanted to go ahead they expressed secular views towards trees and would rather prioritize material interests and gains from the trees. The third point that I want to highlight is the impact that access and the extraction of natural resources, especially the trees, has had on women. Because of, over time, more and more women are being involved in the utilization of natural resources, especially in the tree sector. Our respondents, the interviews were highlighting how women, for instance, were more trustworthy to work with. They were more accommodative to work with and more flexible to work with. And therefore, they were working better as middlemen, for instance. In the extraction of trees, they're the ones who would properly carry firewood from the forest somewhere to the town more effectively than the men. The men were not very trustworthy. You hire him and then he runs away or something of that sort. So you see more and more women are coming into play in the sector. But from the interviews, widows especially were benefiting from such kind of opportunities, because as widows in the context of South Sudan, their opportunities are even lesser, and it's even more challenging for them to support their families. But the ability to engage within the sector has strengthened their livelihood options a little bit. The fourth point that I wanted to highlight is that obviously the debates around whether to extract natural resources or not and all that, or to use the environment or not, has transformed into some forms of resistance from the community. I'll just read from my notes. Some debates have transformed into protests from the interviews we've seen various communities mobilizing to protect their resources, to protect the resources from big men. As you can imagine, if you're a community in a very remote part of South Sudan, and maybe some company comes to extract your trees and then you don't benefit from it, it's really frustrating for them. And considering all these spiritual beliefs they have about their trees. So they have mobilized to protect the environment. They have mobilized to protect their gold from extraction, because there are cases where big men also come and then they want to extract gold within their communities, and then they don't reward or pay back or all that. Even within the oil sector, there are stories around how oil is affecting communities in Unity State. But communities are mobilizing in various ways to resist this. One key example that comes up really well is in Eastern Equatoria in South Sudan, in Nimule to be specific. The women group in Nimule mobilized and formed the women, it's called the Pageri Women Peace Forum. This was a come together of various women, but they incorporated some local leaders, including some government actors who they would work with to protect their natural environment. So these women have, for instance, lobbied against illicit logging within their communities. In 2020, our interviews, one of the respondents highlights that the community reported illicit logging activities to them, and the women were able to take it forward, and that company, their equipment was confiscated, their cars were impounded, and they have been able to shape and control and manage how the environment is being managed. I know I used the example of trees and logging, but this cuts across oil, it cuts across how they protect gold and all that. Nevertheless, these forms of resistance, they say they have successes and challenges, because, as you can imagine, in a very militarized context like South Sudan, usually these big men have access to guns or are armed. So there's a connection between those who are practicing illicit logging or illegal mining with arms. So that connection makes it very difficult for communities to stand up and resist, but there's some form of resistance. I'll conclude. Just to conclude, as you can see, there is a complicated desire of the South Sudanese community to protect their natural resources, or rather to utilize their natural resources to reproduce goods and services and all that in the South Sudan. So even though there is this complicated desire, there is the constant contestation and debate about how they should protect their natural environment. And at the same time, the need to recognize the harsh conditions that people go through. So even though we have these conversations around protecting our ecosystem, there's this constant challenge around the needs and the dire needs of the people in contexts like South Sudan. In addition, sometimes it's easy to assume that non-state actors or that the civil society space in South Sudan is weak, or the formal types of civil society institutions do not, because those formal types of civil society institutions that are NGOs, to be specific, do not exist so much in certain communities. People normally assume that they don't have agency. But we need to recognize that these communities actually do have an agency, and they are struggling and fighting hard to resist. But it's just how do we then support them at that level to resist better and all that.
A very interesting panel here looking at the linkages between climate change, natural resource management, shock resilience through a gendered lens. We've hit all the buzzwords. And also looking at what decarbonization means for natural resource dependent states. Interesting topics here about rentierism and how rentierism would change as you move from dependence on one natural resource to another or to multiple natural resources. I think this ties quite well into the panel that we had yesterday that looked a little bit around what it means to be local and where the foci of that is, and what it would mean to govern these spaces, particularly if the extraction setup in some of the countries was changed. So thanks again so much to the panelists. Thanks for the audience.